Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Hiroshima Day 2021, toward a world free of nuclear weapons. My name is Paula Kirman. I am the president of Ploughshares Edmonton, and I want to welcome you all. I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement. Although this is an online event and we're joining together from different parts of Canada and possibly beyond. The event is being hosted in Amiskawasi, Weskahaikan, known as Edmonton, on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. This event is being done as a webinar, and I'd like to introduce our panel of speakers. The format that this is going to take is I'm going to be asking our speakers a series of questions that they're going to take turns answering. And then we're going to leave the last 15 minutes for questions from the audience. And if you have a question at any time, feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll get to as many as we have time for once we open up the Q&A. But first, like I said, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Today we have the Honorable Douglas Roche, a former senator, member of Parliament, Canadian Ambassador for Disarmament, and U of A visiting professor. We have Cesar Jaramillo, who is Executive Director of Project Ploughshares, and his focus includes nuclear disarmament, outer space security, and conventional weapons control. And our third panelist is Kirsten Mosely, who is in her 4th year of studying political science at the University of Waterloo, and was recently an intern with Project Ploughshares in the spring of 2001, and is passionate about the intersection between disarmament and humanitarian causes. So welcome to our panelists, and we're going to get started with the Q&A. Or excuse me, with the Q&A to the panelists. Kelsey, could I ask that the panelists please be pinned on the screen?
Yep, they should be.
Okay, I'm still seeing it as speaker view, but
in the top right, there might be a view button, and you could switch to gallery.
Okay. All right. So if you want to see all of us on the screen together, since this is going to be a conversation, click the view button here and click on gallery, and that has worked. So the first question is concerning nuclear weapons, which is the most destructive category of weapons ever conceived. And they were used to destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki 76 years ago this week. What does this date mean to you, knowing that 14,000 nuclear warheads remain in existence? Can we be certain in saying never again? I'm going to ask Doug first, if he could take that question.
Thank you. I think our first words at this meeting we're having would be of commemoration for all those in Hiroshima and Nagasaki who were killed by the first use of what became nuclear weapons. And I've been to both Hiroshima and Nagasaki several times, and it certainly changed my life when I saw the horror, interviewed the hibakusha, and went through the museums and saw the evidence of what nuclear weapons are really all about. So that was a dominant thought that we need to keep in mind, namely the lives that were lost on the occasion of the first use of these terrible weapons. But then I turn immediately to, I wouldn't call it by any means a celebration, but at least an observance of the fact that for 76 years, we have not had any repeated use of nuclear weapons. And thus, that is an achievement. perhaps with more luck than good management. But in any event, we are today benefiting from the fact that nuclear weapons have not been used. And thus, that ought to instill in us even stronger reasons of hope and courage and work to develop a truly nuclear weapons-free world. And as we look around the scene today, it is not very encouraging when we see the United States and Russia entering a new nuclear arms race, China now getting involved in a more extended development of nuclear weapons. The modernization programs of all 9 nuclear weapon states is a chilling occurrence. And for a good reason, then, did the UN Undersecretary General for Disarmament, Ms. Nakanishi, say recently that the danger level is higher now than it has been at any time since the end of the Cold War. So we ought to shake off any feeling of lassitude on this subject, while recognizing that we have the capacity in the world, we have a system of laws, basically through the United Nations system, to allow us to go forward into a truly nuclear weapons-free world. And those of us who are working in this movement need to use a day such as today to renew ourselves and say, never again nuclear weapons, but we have to put some work behind it.
Thank you, Doug. Cesar, how would you respond?
Thank you, Paula, and thanks as well to the excellent fellow panelists, Doug and Kirsten, for to be here alongside you virtually. First, I would echo what Doug opened with. To remember what brings us really here today. It is to remember and to mark this solemn occasion that 76 years ago, we know that humanity witnessed so much human suffering that continues to be to this day intergenerational and manifested in several ways. So and that speaks to the heart of the question: never again. And unfortunately, my inclination is to say that no, we cannot be certain today in saying never again, that nuclear weapons may never be used again. In fact, and not to sound too pessimistic, I think there is a good likelihood that unless they are promptly eliminated, they will be used again. And several scholars have recognized and put it very colloquially that it has been sheer dumb luck that they haven't been used again since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Like Doug, I had the chance to be there in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it really is a visceral experience. So one wonders why the actions, the doctrines, the policies of states are still conducive to that possibility of repeating that horror. Having said that, the fact that we cannot say never again does not mean that it is inevitable that they will be used. I firmly believe that the future is not yet written. We craft our own destiny, and that it is not beyond the capacity of the international community, of us, of civil society, of governments to get rid of this absurd and preventable threat. So I think while we cannot be certain in saying never again, I think there are some signs that could allow us to be optimistic that we could change the tide and move more steadfastly towards abolition.
Thank you, Cesar. And now, Kirsten, I'm going to pose those questions to you for response.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with this panel, and it's great to be involved. I'm thinking about this day, it means a lot to me. And I really love what Doug said, that it's been 76 years since we've had a nuclear event. So that's incredible progress. And that's really great in the sense that we're not commemorating, multiple events. And 76 years ago is, it's quite a bit amount of time, but it's not so far back in history that we can say we don't see the effects of those weapons. We don't see the effects of those bombs. And we really see the effects in the fact that there are now 14,000 nuclear weapons in circulation. And that number is, astronomical. And those weapons have a much higher capability than the weapons that we saw on August 6th and August 9th, 76 years ago. So the reaction, I think, to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we still commemorate it all these years later, but there's still a lot of rhetoric about the fact that, maybe the bombs did help end the war. There's a lot talking about the merits of nuclear weapons. And I think that until we get to the point where we recognize that these nuclear weapons launched a whole host of nuclear programs and all of these weapon systems that we are, have the potential to lose control of, have the potential to cause so much destruction over and over again, we can't really talk about how these weapons were helpful. We need to talk about how we can prevent another Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I obviously, I'm really committed to this cause. And I think that there's a big argument for abolition, and that especially we recognize these days every single year, we recognize August 6th and August 9th as days that we should look to and say never again. And if all of the nuclear weapons in existence, all 14,000 were to go off and we were to commemorate every single day, we'd be commemorating for 38 years straight. And I think that's a really good indication of the fact that the potential for nuclear catastrophe with these weapons is so much higher than it's ever been. And until we recognize that and do everything in our power to prevent it, I don't think we can confidently say never again. I think there's tons of steps that we're taking, and there's a lot of really great progress, some of which we'll talk about in a moment. But the potential is so much greater than it was 76 years ago. And I think we need to remember that we're treading on really dangerous water here.
Thank you, Kirsten. We're now going to move on to the next question for the panel. So the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entered into force on January 22nd of this year. Why do you think this was a significant milestone for nuclear disarmament efforts? And what do you hope will change in the global nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime as a result? And Kirsten, I'm going to throw this one back at you to start us off.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or I'll say TPNW, just so it's a bit shorter. I think the TPNW is a significant milestone because it shows that, at least 50 countries, and now more than 50 countries, have signed on to this, and they've been able to get this treaty into force. And that's the countries that have such strong feelings about ridding the world of nuclear weapons. And I think that's really significant. That's not a small coalition, and that number has been largely reached because of the efforts of incredible civil society and humanitarian workers, such as my two panelists here, and probably quite a few of the people involved with Ploughshares Edmonton and Project Ploughshares. And this group of people who truly support and champion the TPNW is absolutely huge, and that is significant in and of itself. And a lot of people talk about the fact that there are no nuclear weapons states that have signed on to the TPNW, and therefore, it's kind of useless. What's the point of this agreement if the countries that have these weapons aren't agreeing to it? It's not binding. But that argument undermines the power of collective will and what groups of countries and individuals can accomplish when there's enough support. And just because the countries who've ratified the TPNW do not have nuclear weapons does not mean that they don't have agency or significant pull in multilateral spheres. There are all sorts of ways that an agreement like the TPNW, with its explicit language about its purpose and its goals, can impact global discussions and make a difference. And I think one of the key features of the TPNW entering into force that often gets overlooked is how it emboldened the disarmament community to keep pushing forward. This is one of the most significant milestones in the last 76 years. Getting it adopted by the UN was a huge initiative, and the fact that it actually entered into force even more so. And it encourages and inspires people like me who are very new to the disarmament field. And after decades of stalemates on topics like this, it's incredibly encouraging to see what can actually happen. And then in terms of what I hope will change, I really hope that citizens will start to demand more transparency from their governments and question why we are spending so much money on nuclear weapons and weapons programs in general. Another powerful feature of the TPNW is the fact that individuals who live in nuclear weapons states, or those protected by nuclear weapons states like Canada, can look to the other countries that have signed on to the TPNW and learn from their activist strategies in how they got their governments to agree to this. Political pressure from citizens is incredibly powerful, and I hope to see Canadians and citizens from other countries that have not signed on using that pressure to demand that their governments spend less on weapons and more on peace and development, and that governments act when their citizens demand it. And with enough pressure, we really can make a difference one country at a time.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'm going to throw it over to Cesar now. What are your thoughts on the TPNW?
Thank you. Yes, lots of thoughts on the TPNW, including endorsing what Kirsten has so eloquently just said. And the question is framed in the future sense. Well, what will change? But one of the things that has already changed is that we are seeing a more emboldened citizenry, including youth like Kirsten, who's joining us here today, and who care obviously, and about the issue, who understand obviously the intricacies of the issue. So that's one very positive aspect just there, the fact that we're seeing really an emboldened civil society, more perhaps in some ways and more sophisticated than we've seen in many years, including youth. So I would really highlight that, and again welcome and endorse everything that Kirsten has said. It was certainly a milestone for nuclear disarmament efforts. I followed it closely. I had the privilege of being there, including on July 7th when it's adopted at the United Nations, and I truly felt, not to overstate this, that there was a sense of history in the making, a new sense of resolve. And it's not that we didn't know already how catastrophic nuclear weapons were, because we do, because we know about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and have long known this. But the intentionality and placing the thrust of this effort on the humanitarian impact of these weapons really changed the discourse. And I think it's continuing to alter the debate about nuclear disarmament, even in the halls of the United Nations, even within the rooms of the United Nations. References to bone cancer, to burn children, to intergenerational damage, as part of statements. And really, and diplomats themselves are human beings, and some of these stories really resonate with them, and the TPNW really brought these elements, these humanitarian elements, to the fore. More specifically, there have been some changes in countries like Spain, like Belgium, parliamentary debates, very, substantial parliamentary debates about the merits of the TPNW. And it's just a matter of time before these intensify, including in countries like Canada and other members of NATO and other nuclear dependent states that are part of nuclear umbrella, and because the tide is inevitable. These debates will intensify. More and more people will become aware of what is at stake, and that can only be a positive thing. We're seeing patterns of divesting, where people and individuals, pension funds, are being more intentional about where they put their money, and more intentional about where they do not put their money. And campaigns around these divesting, because if nuclear weapons may well continue, but not with our money. That sort of mentality, and I think that's a very effective pressure mechanism. I think the victims, and the hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the survivors of nuclear testing, not just in Japan, elsewhere, are really have gotten a moment of recognition that they deserve, like really, as because it's such a shameful state of humanity that I think this whole process and everything around it has rightly so, shown a light on victimhood as a thing that should trigger really concrete policy action. And going forward, public opinion polls, including in Canada and elsewhere, show that this is an unstoppable trend. I think this is an absurd threat to have hanging over our shoulders. I think sooner or later we're going to, as the saying say, eliminate nuclear weapons before they eliminate us. So, yes.
Thank you, Cesar. And now, Doug, what are your thoughts?
All great social transformation movements go through 3 stages. First, the establishment ridicules it. Second, the establishment vigorously objects to it. And third, the establishment takes it in as part of their policy. This obtained in all the movements that we've witnessed in the last century or so, 2 centuries, the anti-slavery movement, apartheid, civil rights, decolonization, and now nuclear weapons. For a long time, the major powers just ridiculed those who were standing up for nuclear disarmament. Now that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the Prohibition Treaty, has surfaced, the major powers are vigorously objecting to it. They are taking it seriously because they know that it does stand in the way of public acceptance of the continuation of nuclear deterrence as a standard military doctrine. So I think we should take some heart from the fact that the Prohibition Treaty is now definitely on the table. It's on the agenda. So this brings us, of course, very, very much to Canada and why Canada has not signed the treaty and joined it. And it's because of our allegiance to NATO. NATO has taken a position that nuclear weapons are the supreme guarantee of security. And NATO also has issued very strong statements, most recently, just a month or so ago, against the treaty. And the Washington, Paris, and London have all said that they'll never sign the treaty. So the Prohibition Treaty advocates now have to make a very careful calculation that they do not advance that we do not advance this in sort of opposition to what is currently the framework for nuclear disarmament, namely the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Some would say that the Prohibition Treaty is trying to replace the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I think that we should emphasize, as the Prohibition Treaty itself does, that the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is supposed to lead to negotiations for the elimination of nuclear weapons, is the cornerstone of the nuclear disarmament regime. And the Prohibition Treaty is an aid, it's an assistance to that. It presses us forward. And that's the position I think we should come to in Canada, to have Canada push NATO from within NATO, push NATO to change its policies. And to do that, of course, we need companies. So there, in Europe, there are movements in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and probably a couple of others, where there is a public tide is turning, as Cesar alluded to a moment ago. The public tide is beginning to turn. And this is the time for us to keep on our pressure in favor of the Prohibition Treaty as an aid to the existing Non-Proliferation Treaty, as a spur to move it forward. And that positive approach to the Prohibition Treaty is a way of breaking down the opposition that we're now facing.
Thank you, Doug. We're now going to move on to our next question. So the doomsday clock is getting closer to midnight. The JCPOA is all but dead. The DPRK nuclear situation remains unresolved. Non-nuclear members of NATO continue to support the nuclear weapons held by their allies. This seems like a recipe for despair about the prospects for nuclear disarmament. How and why do you remain hopeful, and where do you see progress happening? I'm gonna ask.
Thank you, Paula. I'll begin. I think you were muted the last couple of seconds, but I'll start and then perhaps hand it over to Doug, followed by Kirsten. Yes, you know, that's a pretty grim listing of very troubling developments in the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime, and really arguably one might say a recipe for despair. If you add that to that, the fact that I follow other files such as the arms trade and developments in military technologies, artificial intelligence, aerospace security, then you know, then the recipe for despair seems even richer. Yet I remain hopeful, and when it comes to the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime specifically, I do. And perhaps I'll start my answer by saying what sort of developments do not make me any less hopeful, and I'll say that the resistance from the nuclear weapons states to this whole TPNW effort does not faze me and should not surprise anyone. You know, what would be surprising if they had enthusiastically embraced this thing that is challenging the status quo and is challenging, you know, decades of well-entrenched security doctrine. That would have been surprising. You know, we should have seen it coming. It was predictable enough. You know, these are well-entrenched mentalities and well-entrenched, you know, across various levels of government, and old habits die hard, and not to oversimplify this matter. So I would, yeah, I don't think we should be too surprised or faced by that resistance. You know, we need to acknowledge it and overcome that resistance, you know, and be creative and clever about it. But yes, you know, so these developments are not perhaps a recipe for despair. These are they were the trigger for the action, you know, and it is because of a very conscious recognition of this, you know, maelstrom of just very troubling actions that the international community said, okay, enough is enough. We need a different path, and I think that TPNW embodied that collective pent-up frustration with the system's inability to deliver on the long-held promise of nuclear abolition. Where do we see progress? You know, I think in various parts, but I think one key area for progress is really the turning tide in public opinion, and this is in a way tied to the explosion in the availability of information. You know, these used to be very obscure topics for specialists, if you will. Now, you know, we all know who has weapons and more or less how many, and even where their silos are, and, you know, with a great degree of specificity and what public opinion is even in those countries. So I think that the level of sophistication, again, in civil society, for instance, in advocacy, is not surprising. You know, we have WhatsApp and real-time communications and Twitter and 24-hour news cycles and all these things. So I think that greater awareness can only be positive in an endeavor such as nuclear abolition, because without public pressure, it will simply not happen. I don't think it will, at least not in the near future. So there has to be that element of a very concerted, intentional public pressure on levels of government for it to move the needle a little bit. And I do see progress there. You know, there was a saying that there's a crack, then you start to see the light. You know, I think even with NATO, there may be a little bit of that, and then it's just a matter of time before one. We don't need, you know, 20 plus members of NATO to simultaneously, you know, embrace the TPNW. We need one, you know, and it takes courage, and it takes a really, at the end of the day, political leadership. I am not persuaded that it comes down to, let's look at the NATO documents and the TPNW language to see how compatible they are, or they are not. You know, that's for the government lawyers, and that can be overcome, and that can be argued, by the way, one way or another at the end of the day. It comes down to political leadership. Could be Justin Trudeau, you know, we'll see. There's a bit of time still to see that, but it may not be. Or it could be somebody in the UK. It could be, well, the UK is a nuclear power, but it could be, you know, any number of members of NATO could really have the foresight, the courage, the audacity to move this forward, and really I think with a reasonable expectation that if that happens, others are all the more likely to follow that lead. So yeah.
Thank you, Cesar. I'm going to throw it over to Doug now.
Well, on this question of hope and how to maintain hope in the face of a lot of bad news items every day, I think it's helpful to stand back a bit and look at the world and take into our thinking, you know, that for 200 years, the world has lived in a culture of war, and which produced, among other things, World War I and World War II. Now we are clearly moving toward a culture of peace. That culture began with the formation of the United Nations, and it's been extended by the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the understanding of how rights across a full spectrum, including women and children and disabled and many other kinds of people, is growing. And all this movement from a culture of war to a culture of peace, which centers around the concept of nonviolence, as Gandhi taught us, this movement is the result of what is a clear expression of a new global conscience. We're not just conscious of other people through communications and all that. Our conscience about how we are going to treat one another in the world as human beings and how we're going to treat the planet itself, that has clearly risen in recent years. And so the defining of a culture of peace has already been done at the United Nations, and it's quite a shame that such valuable work has not gained the public attention it deserves. It was coming to a head around the year 2000 through a series of things that had been done, but it was eclipsed by the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which brought a resurgence of militarism. And so in the 20 years since 9/11, we've had extended militarism. But that does not take away from the basic point I'm making here now, which is that we are moving from a culture of war to a culture of peace. More people today obtain more benefits from all the attributes of the world, whether it's medicine, science, technology, it's a long list of things. More people are gaining from that. Is there war? Is there poverty? Is there terrible things brought about, particularly by the coronavirus, showing the vulnerability of peoples and nations? Of course. So, and that we tend to see that, to think about that, without seeing the broader sweep. And so I'm putting these things out now in answer to this question about hope and despair. I think that there's every reason for hope that the elevation of humanity toward a better understanding of what is needed for us to live in a peaceful coexistence in the world is rising. Much more work needs to be done, but we should build on that which we have already accomplished.
Thank you, Doug. And I'm going to hand it over to Kirsten.
Thank you. I think, yeah, building off exactly what Doug's just said, I remain very hopeful for a very similar reason. And that's because I feel like this global moment is incredibly ripe for change, not just in the nuclear weapons field or, other fields, but really in this moment of COVID-19 recovery and kind of how we're really still struggling with this pandemic. It's an incredibly great time to focus on the things that governments can be doing for their people that have nothing to do with weapons and war. It's a great time for people to reflect on what they want in their society, whether that's, more public health care, better work programs, better school programs, to really focus on these things because we've seen such a scaling back in the last year and a half because of COVID. And I think people are really, really open to thinking about what the future could look like and to moving beyond this state of whatever it's been in the past is what it has to be in the future. I think people are really ready for very significant change. And, again, as Doug said, there's still lots of things to overcome, but the public opinion around things can be better and we can have a role in that is incredibly encouraging. And that's also a very hard conversation to have when things are generally going well for, a good majority of the world or a good majority of societies. And I also have hope because I think that this next generation is so feisty for change. And I use the word feisty very intentionally because the tactics of youth, and I include myself in this generation, but also those much younger than me, are so excited about making change. People who are still, in high school and just beginning their university careers, they are fired up. They use social media to their advantage, and they don't really care about these decades of precedent, these, bureaucratic policies and procedures they have to go to. They just want things to be different. And again, speaking to what Doug spoke about with that global conscience, they really have it. They really have a sense of what's going on in the world and that it can be better. And this generation is incredibly innovative, and they really are using solutions and seeking solutions to problems that haven't been addressed before. And there absolutely will be a boom in these younger people using alternative forms of energy, such as nuclear energy, as we move further and further away from fossil fuels. And we can expect that will continue to spur conversations about appropriate uses of these really great things like nuclear energy, and talking about how we can use them well and how we can use them poorly. And nuclear proliferation is one of those things that I think really seems unimaginable when you actually communicate the cost of it and the number of weapons. And I think young people are just fed up and they're not going to take it for that much longer, to be honest. I see a lot of progress in these places. Of course, there's lots more to be done, but I am hopeful because I think there's a real big movement of people just ready to make a difference and to have things be different, especially than they've been this last couple years, but different than the past many years. And I think that's right around the corner.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. I've got one more set of questions for our panelists, and I just want to remind all of our people here today who are watching this webinar that if you have a question, We're going to be opening it up to a Q&A for the last 15 minutes of the program. And please feel free to drop your question into the chat, and we'll get to as many as we have time for. So my last set of questions for our panelists is, do you think the renewed attention to the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons has influenced public discourse and attitudes about this threat? And if so, how? And what would you say to the Canadian government about its responsibility to contribute credibly to nuclear abolition? And let's get started with Kirsten.
Great, thank you. I absolutely think that the renewed attention has been incredibly important. I think when we talk about nuclear weapons, it is very, very easy to ignore the human costs and to make it more of a moral discussion about, whether nuclear weapons are bad or not. When we focus on the humanitarian aspect, we see that it's really key, especially with nuclear testing and development. Sure, there's only been 2 instances where bombs were actually dropped, which are, of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they were terrible events. But there's also an incredible number of people who've been affected by the testing, affected by the runoff as it gets into the ecosystems, affected that, probably in ways that we still don't actually realize, because a lot of these are still going on. And when we talk about the human cost of nuclear weapons, we really need to paint that full picture, that it's not just these 2 events, but it's everything after the fact. It's the fact that you're still seeing radiation effects from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that we really need to be aware that there's a whole host of issues associated with even having these weapons in existence. And tying back to my previous comments, I think it's really fair to talk about nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon programs in terms of what social programs they cost. If we reframed our arguments about nuclear weapons to talk about, this weapon costs the equivalent of 15 hospitals, or this development of a new type of weapon could feed this many million people for however many years, we're focusing on the human costs. We're talking about what we're missing when we're spending money on these weapons. And I think that's a really important reframing that people really start to understand. And when we show that the last 76 years of spending on nuclear weapons also diverted funds and talent away from causes that really could have saved lives in the future, it's not even comparable. We talk about that humanitarian impact. That is the impact of making sure people understand what we've lost to nuclear weapons and what we still stand to lost. And that's before we even get into the conversation about nuclear weapons and climate change, which is, that could be its own webinar entirely, and many webinars to come. But this climate action movement is so strong, and it's growing so strong, that I just really hope that people can continue to tie in nuclear weapons into the climate action movement, because they are so intricately connected. And then in terms of what I would say to the Canadian government, I would ask them to really take a leadership role here and to focus on what their contribution to the nuclear conversation can be. They can choose to, continue sitting on the sidelines, or they can really live up to our reputation as a middle power who likes to get in the thick of things and lead the way for NATO to get involved in nuclear abolition. And I think Canada holds a really unique position in this game, and they're not really leveraging that to its fullest extent. We see that Canadians support abolition, like Cesar mentioned, and that we want our government to respond. And I want the Canadian government to respond by actually representing our interests well on the world stage in this topic and standing up for abolition. Again, Canada is so uniquely positioned because of NATO and because of our relationships with our closest allies, who happen to be nuclear weapons states. And I believe that they really can take a strong position. So I think they should just do that. And perhaps it's naive to say, just take the action. But again, this younger generation that I'll pull myself into, we just want change, and we're ready for that. So my advice is, let's just make a change and stop talking about it and actually do it. And I think Canada can really take that step.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'm now going to ask Cesar to respond.
Yes, thank you, Paula. And again, just building on what Kirsten was saying, if you don't see that change that you want to see happen, then you wait a bit and you'll make it happen yourselves, your generation, directly, because that's what's going to happen, sooner or later. So I think the political leaders, the current political leaders, need to realize that change is coming. I mean, if they don't make it happen, then they will sooner or later need to get out of the way. So people who will affect that change make it happen. Yes, the renewed attention on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons has influenced public discourse in a very positive way. I gave the example of, just how in the halls of the UN, in the conferences themselves, the discourse has changed, and then so many references to the specific humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, the testimonies of survivors who have firsthand knowledge of that, and the way I know it resonates with people who are in the room. I've seen tears and hugs and goosebumps, in these conversations, because it's real and because it does generate that visceral reaction. And the broader diplomatic sort of approach, strategy, conversation, I think it has also been influenced. I think the traditional attributes of power, which are still real, by the way, military might and commercial economic power and all these things, they are still real, not to be naive. But I think these new principled sort of attributes are increasingly relevant, and in a real way, not in a sort of soft power, wishy-washy way. I think the international community, the countries have found resolve rallying around these principled approaches to nuclear disarmament. They have found strength in numbers, and they have found it easier, rather than putting their individual neck out to do this in numbers, and finding that they do actually have common ground on their desire to see concrete progress towards nuclear abolition, and very critically on their impatience and their frustration for the lack of progress on the part of nuclear armed states. So I think it's it has changed public discourse. I mean, Kirsten also mentioned, I think the cost of it. I had a comment to say about that, just how offensive it is to human dignity, to any sense of fairness, to any sense of just allocation of limited resources, to see these multi-billion-dollar expenditures when we're seeing that the sustainable development goals that were launched with such fanfare, their specific targets are unfunded, but not by billions of dollars, but by millions, and in some cases by hundreds of thousands of dollars unfunded. And then we cannot meet these targets, these very urgent targets, and there's so many social basic needs that go unmet every day around the world. So that allocation of resources is always offensive, I think, to a basic sense of human dignity. With the Canadian government, I mean, one thing is really I would highlight, as I often do, this very increasingly apparent gap between lofty rhetoric and action. Canada is very good. No one denies it at the lofty rhetoric part, aspirational, lofty rhetoric about our role in the world and the extent to which we support nuclear abolition. But a couple of things in that regard. One, rhetorical support for a world free of nuclear weapons is not in and of itself a contribution to that world. Everyone rhetorically supports a world free of nuclear weapons. Everyone. No one is going on the record in the international community, we want a world full of nuclear weapons where there's more proliferation, etc. So Canada tends to put a lot of value into this rhetorical part of the equation. We want a world, but the actions are lacking, and they really are, especially for a country that does have attributes that could make a difference. This well-earned credibility as a middle power, as an honest broker, the membership in NATO, the membership in the G7, in the G20, as an active member of the nuclear energy industry. So Canada has these attributes that, put to good use, could really make a difference and lead the way, and knowing that there would be resistance, not being a naive about NATO pressures and all of these things, but I think Canada can and should really do more. I think it's a bit generous, as much as I agree with everything Kirsten has said, to put Canada as sitting in the sidelines. I think on the nuclear disarmament question, I would say put Canada firmly as part of the problem, and more than as part of the solution, with its policies within NATO, its membership in the Nuclear Weapons Planning Group. And despite the fact that we proudly show up to NPT meetings, wearing this non-nuclear weapon state badge proudly, because we're responsible actors. The reality is that we're walking a very, very sort of a dual line here, where at the same time we are endorsing, directly legitimizing the nuclear weapons held by our allies in NATO, and that contradiction is untenable, and it can, it's like speaking from two sides of the mouth. So that is something that needs to change.
Thank you, Cesar. And finally, Doug, what are your thoughts?
Well, both my fellow panelists have given very extensive and deep responses to this question. I don't want to repeat everything they've said. I agree with virtually everything that's been said. But look at what's this question all about? It's about the responsibility of Canada. So look at a map of the world and look at Canada. Here we are, the second largest territorial land mass in the world. And we're blessed with space in our country, technology, a low population base. We have everything that is required to contribute to a world that desperately needs the components of the peace agenda: arms control, and disarmament, economic and social development, environmental protection, human rights. I mean, those are the main pillars of the peace agenda. And Canada, as a middle power, we're not a super country to, we don't have the economy to push hard, but we have the intelligence to insert ourselves into the ongoing global dialogue. And that was done for many years. And outstanding Canadians made contributions on behalf of Canada through the United Nations system. But what happened? Like in the last two elections for the Security Council, in 2010, 2020, Canada was defeated. That was a shock to many people who haven't been following closely the diminishment of Canada's contributions to the global scene. And so our fallback in peacekeeping, our fallback in international aid, these are now measured by other states that now think that Canada is not as good as we Canadians seem to think we are ourselves. So what's needed, first of all, to implement some turnaround is a massive wake-up call in Canada to get ourselves back to a system of thinking that we have a responsibility to contribute to the world. And that responsibility is staring us in the face in the distribution of vaccines, in the cutting down of nuclear weapons, those who have them, pressing the Prohibition Treaty forward, increasing the United Nations strength through a permanent UN peacekeeping force. Those are the essential points, and all of which can be expanded, that Canada needs to advance if we had the will to do so. Now, apparently we're going to have an election in a few days. I don't know whether we will or not, but all the pundits seem to think we will. So are we going to be discussing all these questions in an election? I bet we won't. And this is what part of the problem, because we in Canada we're asleep at the switch of this dynamic turn in history at this transformation moment. And we desperately need to wake up.
Thank you, Doug. We're now going to move into the Q&A portion of the program. And I've seen a few really great questions come up in the chat. So we're going to get started right away with a question from Dawn, who asks, with so many urgent problems on everyone's mind, COVID, environmental crises, wars, poverty, racism, how can you make people conscious of this again as it was in the 60s? Doug, maybe we'll start off with you again.
I missed the word. How can we make Canada?
How can we make people conscious of this again like it was in the 60s?
Yeah, well, we got to speak out. The civil society groups have been customarily strong, and we need to recover that linkage in which civil society actively participated in the decision-making processes of the government. So the government itself has to become more open to civil society, and civil society needs to be able to speak in a more coherent way to the government. So I would say the increase in dialogue. Dialogue is the first requisite of having a sort of a mutual respect in going forward. If we could center that dialogue on the United Nations agenda, which is it's an all-embracing concept of how humanity must live at this turning point in history. And I think that education programs, civil society itself doing education, outreach, communications, a more vigorous extension of our hopes for a better world. And I think this is what will develop this elusive thing called political will. Do we really care enough? And each of us, well, the people in this program obviously care, but I mean, as the politicians now going into this election, as they look around their own constituencies, they say to themselves, do people care? What do people care about? We need to express a caring for humanity that reaches out beyond ourselves and connect that to the government.
Thank you, Doug. Kirsten.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a question I think about all the time. And my usual answer is the fact that all of these crises are interconnected. They all have things in common with one another. And the success of all of these movements, like climate action, like, getting better inclusion for LGBTQ plus folks, eradicating poverty, racism, and anti-racism work, they're all so connected to the cause of disarmament in general. And I think that's absolutely key to communicate to people that, if we're talking about getting people out of poverty, one of the great ways is to stop spending so much money on weapons. If we're talking about, helping this climate action program and focusing on policy that makes sense in terms of our future and the environment, a great way is to stop committing nuclear waste into this system. And again, same thing with, poverty, racism, all of these aspects. People who are already marginalized are further marginalized by the presence of weapons, and especially by nuclear weapons. Indigenous communities and people of color, their communities are especially affected by nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons testings. And if we treat these as siloed issues, we're going to deal with them as siloed issues, and that is never going to lead to lasting change. So they're interconnected. There's systemic change that breaches all of these avenues. And it's incredibly important to communicate that to people so we don't get stuck in our own issues and forget that making change is a collective and we all need to work together.
Thanks, Kirsten. Cesar, would you like to respond?
Yes, briefly, and to echo both what Doug said and what Kirsten just said. Yeah, it's I think about identifying those linkages that are in fact there, but they need to be seen. I mean, just to give you a couple of examples, drawing from Don's very pertinent question. COVID, the sense of collective vulnerability like we haven't felt, in ages, perhaps, or the first time in my lifetime. The sense of vulnerability that should make it easier to relate to, a threat like nuclear weapons, that threatens us all. The environmental concerns that are usually put alongside nuclear weapons as one of two really existential threats that could really literally alter the course of human civilization are right there. But the environment in turn, we're starting to see more and more the environmental security nexus, and environmental concerns being triggers for forced migration, for poverty, for all of these things. So as Kirsten well said, all of these things are interconnected. We need to see these linkages, and there are some efforts, but I think it has to do with realization. I think this really is a very important juncture in human civilization, and not to sound too esoteric about or to make it like an overstatement, but this whole notion of business as usual. It cannot be little, adjustments. We're at a point where it's urgent. Look at the environmental question. There's in the past couple of months, fires in BC and floods in Germany and record temperatures in a bunch of places around the world. And if you look at the nuclear question, JCPOA crumbling and tensions between nuclear powers and everything. But if you look at any public health, of course. So there is really this, I think, a need for vision in political leadership that looks beyond the next election, that really thinks about humanity, and hopefully, whether in the top powers or in the middle powers, we will be able to see that in the next little while. Otherwise, not to to wrap up in a note of pessimism, but we have to see that vision, that longer term, big picture thinking vision. I will plug, I mean, just briefly, my friend, Meta Spencer, known to some of you. She has a project called To Save the World. And the premise there is precisely to link all this seemingly disparate, but in reality connected threats to human civilization, that unless they are tackled and tackled with a holistic vision, really we may soon be in trouble. I think that we need it. Not to repeat myself too much, we need political, vision in our political leaders to really identify these linkages and the real implications of not addressing them properly.
Thank you, Cesar. I think we have time for one more question. And we do have another question here from Paul, who asks, with the rapid increase in AI and superintelligence research, is there even more urgency to deal with the nuclear abolition question before military decision-making is potentially taken out of human hands? Cesar, I'll throw that one to you first.
A very, very, very pertinent and I would say prescient question, because we may soon be faced with that, with those sorts of scenarios. I think that the advances and the speed, the rapidity with which we are seeing these advances really make it inevitable that AI will necessarily be a big consideration in the command and control infrastructure of nuclear weapons. For example, the vulnerabilities may increase. The not just AI but cyber and all of these new technologies are going to are going to be a new lens through which we need to look at the vulnerabilities of nuclear weapons, and it's not a far-fetched. It is a scary concept, but it's not a far-fetched concept that some of these critical decisions may be moving away from humans and more closely towards algorithms and that sort of the sort of decision-making systems, which, and this is a longer conversations, are full of biases and there's lots of problems in that equation. But yes, I think the new technologies will soon be growing, and they already are, and they may challenge. This is a bit of a side note. I think if there is something that may challenge the orthodoxy around our understanding of nuclear weapons as the most powerful weapon ever conceived, may be new technologies. Something that may alter that equation and whose implications are yet to be seen. But new technologies will certainly have an impact in the future of warfare, and will, comparable to that of nuclear weapons.
Thanks, Cesar. Kirsten, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, just very briefly, this is definitely outside my my field of study a little bit, but I think what Cesar said about it kind of becoming the perfect storm. We have these huge weapons and many of them in circulation, and with the capability to destroy pretty much everything as we know it. And then we have the development of new technology that seeks to take a lot of that decision making out of the matrix. And I often think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, arguably one of the closest times we ever got to another Hiroshima-like event, you could say, and the fact that really in the end it was stopped by individuals making decisions. And when you take that out of the mix and you leave that to a robot or an algorithm or whatever it might be in the future, that is a scary thought, and it becomes the perfect storm for us really creating our own destruction. And again, that's a pretty heavy note to end on, but I think that is really key moving forward, that this discussion is definitely not irrelevant. It's not 76 years too late. It's very much relevant because these issues will continue through the future.
And Doug, we'll let you have the last word.
Well, in such a discussion, there's no last word. But I'm glad that this question came up at the end, because I wanted to bring us back to Hiroshima Day. As our discussion over the last hour progressed, it opened up and widened into the connecting issues that make up the globalization issue and interrelated problems and so on. And it's true, all of that is there. But what is happening to a lot of people, of course, it becomes overwhelming because the issues are piled up and interlocked. They say, how can I do it? It's all too much. Let's go and see a movie or something, So I was faced with this myself many years ago when I saw what was happening in the world. And so I made a conscious decision in my own life in respect of dealing with the agenda called peace in the world to concentrate on nuclear weapons. And I did it for this reason, that I believe that humanity is on a program of elevation through history. And given enough time, we will be able to resolve some of the problems that revolve around the United Nations issues. But we have to, in the meantime, avoid blowing up the place. And so the most urgent of all the problems is the problem of total destruction, the annihilation of peoples through nuclear weapons, which have now acquired even new, more fantastic abilities through hypersonic weapons and so on. And now, as the questioner says, coming into artificial intelligence, when the very personal decision-making as to whether or not we're going to retaliate what will be taken from human hands and put into machines. I mean, what a horrible world. And so I come back, I guess we're closing, I come back to the issue of the Prohibition Treaty. What can I do as one person in this big milieu of issues? What can I do? Well, I can single out one issue and press hard as I can on that issue. For me, that's the Prohibition Treaty. I'd like to press on the Non-Proliferation Treaty because it embraces the whole, virtually all the countries of the world. But because it has been so discredited, the Prohibition Treaty has come along, and the Prohibition Treaty, it delegitimizes nuclear weapons. It makes them illegal for those who sign that treaty. And so that's something people can understand. Ban the ban treaty, ban the bomb, make it illegitimate, concentrate our work on this. So I think we should push the Canadian government to take the Prohibition Treaty very seriously and work in NATO to change NATO's policies so that NATO becomes a supporter rather than opponent of the Prohibition Treaty. That's a way that we can concentrate our efforts and stay sane at the same time. Thanks to my fellow panelists a bit, I think it's been a great experience. And I'd just say a word to Kirsten. I mean, your comments today, you gave me a lot of hope.
And on that note, I want to thank everyone so much, to all of our speakers, and also to everyone who took time out of their Saturday afternoon to join us today. These are really important issues to discuss and to keep discussing, and I'm sure we could keep going. We could keep on going talking about this for hours, but we want to respect people's time and leave it here. So thank you again for coming. There's going to be a recording of this webinar put on Ploughshares Edmonton's Facebook page, and I'm possibly in some other places as well. So please stay tuned for that if you'd like to share it or watch it again. And once again, have a great afternoon, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you everybody, and thanks to Doug and Kirsten and my colleague Kelsey, who was running the back end here. Thank you very much.
Absolutely want to thank Kelsey as well for helping us get going here and keeping everything running so smoothly.
Okay, have a great day, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.